Hello, I'm Don Mitchell. I'm happy to be back speaking with you again in another video in this series about the book I helped co-author, The 2000% Solution. In this video, we'll be considering Chapter 1, The Stall Mindset, which is part of Part 1 of the book, in which we look at stalls. Well, just in case you don't remember what a stall is or haven't heard about it before, let me define that for you. It's simply an unproductive practice that's become such a habit that it doesn't get considered for doing something different that would be more productive or, in fact, less harmful. As an example, we often see athletes develop superstitions. And in developing those superstitions, they will continue to operate in performing whatever ritual occurred the last time something good happened or the last time some bad thing was avoided. As a result, over a number of years, these athletes can get to the point where they spend more time engaged in the rituals than they do in the kind of practice that would help them to perform better. So in today's lesson, we'll be looking at two kinds of stalls, two kinds of bad habits. First, that come from individuals. The book does not discuss the neurological and biological bases of stalls, but I think it's worth adding just a little bit of information about that. Basically, what happens is that anytime we associate two things together, especially if we feel strong emotions while we do so, either of great happiness or sadness, we will build neurological networks that will connect those elements so that whenever either of them occurs in our experience or we think of them, we will make the association with the other thing. So that's sort of what makes habits so powerful. And in fact, if we've been doing the same thing consistently for a period of 30 to 45 days, a habit becomes as strong in many cases as if we'd been doing it for several years. So it's although the good news is that habits can be harmful if they're bad habits, it's also good news that we can form new habits by stopping doing what we had done before that was a bad habit and developing particularly new associations. To do so, though, there's a sort of a key element. When we're operating based on our stalls, we're sort of like we're an automatic pilot of the sort that when an airplane, after it takes off, the pilot and co-pilot usually flip on something called the automatic pilot, which actually keeps the plane level and going on the ideal trajectory. And in fact, it does it so well that things get performed more efficiently than if the pilots were actually had their hands on the controls and were directing things. In fact, some of the worst airline accidents have occurred during unfortunate circumstances in which the pilots panicked, turned off the autopilot, which would have in fact solved the problem, and instead tried to fix it themselves and in turn did the wrong thing. As an example, really, of doing so, there's a report about the sinking of the Titanic. And in those days, if you were running the wheel of a large ship, you had to actually spin the wheel in the opposite direction to which you wanted the ship to go. Having observed a iceberg straight ahead, the steersman panicked and actually threw the wheel in the wrong direction, actually increasing the chances of a collision, the sideways collision that eventually breached too many of the watertight compartments in the Titanic and caused it to sink. Not wanting to embarrass the steersman for having made this all too human mistake, the people who had observed this kept this information secret until recent years. And in fact, I've often been struck by how many bad results have happened as a result of simply habits that we're unthinking. Now, lest you think that I'm immune from these, the running joke in our family was for many years that if I headed towards Boston from my home in the suburbs, I would automatically drive to the church that we attended at that time. And the reason was that I usually went to Boston just to attend church. And if I was going to Boston for some other reason, I would still automatically not think about getting there. I would end up arriving at church. We can actually become so unthinking while we do these things that we're really not even aware of our surroundings. I can remember a number of times when I had a long commute of almost 2 hours to Hartford, Connecticut, where I left my office in the Hartford area, arrived home in the Boston area, having driven for almost 2 hours, and couldn't remember a single thing I'd seen along the way. Somehow my subconscious mind had operated the car efficiently, but it was just as though I lost those 2 hours. So clearly, to break these habits is important. And the first step is to challenge them. And of course, you can't challenge them unless you're aware of them. So you really kind of have to start out by monitoring your performance. And if you don't have a good way to do that, or you're not very self-aware, then you may have to ask those around you what you do more or less automatically. And then stop and ask yourself a series of questions, all of which are outlined in the lesson, about what those benefits are of taking those actions, what would be the benefits of taking different actions, and some of the thoughts that might go into combining actions so that you didn't have the dead time. For example, all those years I was wasting 3 to 4 hours a day driving to and from the Hartford area, I could have been listening to self-improving tapes. Now, I did that for part of the time, but I didn't do it all the time. So I missed the opportunity to gain hundreds of hours of learning that would have been beneficial for most of my life, since I was a fairly young man while I was doing all that driving. Of course, if I had stopped to think about the fact that if I had a job in the Boston area, I wouldn't be doing all that driving in the first place. That might have even been a more productive, solution to the problem. And eventually, of course, I did make that change, but I did spend almost 4 years on the road before realizing my mistake. Okay, so in doing this, obviously it's helpful for an individual to break stalls and to adopt better practices. Organizations have the same issue, and the issue is compounded by the fact that we've been conditioned by society to pay a lot of attention to social cues around us. For example, all things being equal, we think the boss is somebody we should pay a lot of attention to. And we do that even when the boss may not have a very good idea what he or she is doing, and the boss, in fact, may be on the wrong track. In fact, it's a rare organization where the boss gets challenged. In fact, the boss is usually the last person to know that there is an issue. And even if it was an issue that the boss assuredly would have wanted to do something about. Another example of social cues is it's very hard to stand out from the crowd for most of us. So if you're in a conference room with 32 people, an experience I don't recommend, by the way, and they are all nodding their heads yes, and you think it's no, you probably aren't going to say anything. So there is a tendency to keep doing things. Also, we're all aware of how things get done around here. Maybe there always has to be a meeting. Maybe it's something there always has to be a study conducted. Perhaps there is just a process that always goes through, and then nothing gets done at the end of the process. Whatever that method is, it becomes a form of madness over time, because it means that everything has to go through that, even when it's sort of a no-brainer to make a change more quickly. For example, imagine that you have an angry customer, and your policy for how to handle angry customers it has some problems in it. Well, immediately you need to do something for that customer, because if you don't, they're not going to be happy to wait for months until you kind of change what you've been doing. So what you need to do instead is kind of react on the spot, do something, and then go back and look at the policy. Well, in companies that are very hidebound in their rules, in fact, that customer is going to be lost, even if eventually the policy gets changed to something more productive. We also have the fact that it's harder to change an organization because whereby you might be changing just yourself when you're in the course of taking an action or making a decision or doing something. With an organization, you have to sort of change everybody. And if the key person has to be chosen, then that key person holds out, the boss, as it were, then you're going to have a hard time getting things done until the boss really is converted. And I've met an awful lot of bosses who have a hard time making decisions, and so that can slow down things really quite a bit. In fact, and even in quite a small organization, the boss can be quite a stall simply because she or he wants all the decisions to be run past him or her. And when that's the case, everybody sort of stands around waiting for this very busy person to finally get around dealing with something that needs immediate reaction. We also see that organizations tend to repeat what they feel made them successful. And once made them successful may have absolutely nothing to do with the current, environment. Yet the company will continue to go on and do those things that once made it successful. And we cite the example in this lesson in chapter 1 about IBM and how it continued to charge premium prices for its great service long after the fact when its service was any better than anybody else's service. And it took bringing an outsider, Lou Gerstner, to change the pricing so that it was pricing that was similar to everybody else for a service that was about as good as everybody else. And of course, immediately the company was much more successful by making that adjustment. In a somewhat related book, The Ultimate Competitive Advantage, Carol Coles and I argue that the key to future success of organizations is going to be to repeatedly blow up the business model, the way things are done, and that should be done about every 2, 3, or 4 years. And that's, I think, advice has continued to be sound. So if you're going to form a new good habit, it would be to go and challenge all of your practices on some regular basis so that you do look at what are the benefits of doing these things, what are the drawbacks of doing these things, what are the alternatives, and so forth. Now, keep in mind that in being aware of the stall set, that's not and just enough to get rid of things. You may need some ideas for how to eliminate a particular kind of a stall. Now, as we go into future chapters and lessons in the 2000% solution, I'll be talking specifically about those. Keep in mind that complacency is always an issue, no matter what the other issues are. By complacency, I mean simply, well, if things are not terrible, why make a change? Well, that's a very poor reason to keep doing something because you might be performing so poorly that you're really wasting a tremendous amount of time. And I'm often struck by the value of measurements in this regard. I've often interviewed organizations where everyone told me that they were outstanding at some activity that they do, and I then later had the opportunity to measure what they did and then compare it to other organizations to something similar. And I've literally had cases where companies are operating at maybe 5% of their potential compared to somebody else, and yet they were proclaiming that they were the best, in the world. And it wasn't true. I've also had the opposite happen, which is very interesting, where we've done measurement studies where people would say they thought they were very bad at something, and in fact, they were better than anyone else we could find. So it's fairly clear to me that most of us aren't aware of how our performance compares to what other people are accomplishing. We can't see ourselves in a comparison mirror unless somebody helps us in the way that we can see how tall we are by just standing up against a door frame and measuring our height, or how much we weigh by standing on a scale. So I will encourage you to become more aware of your habits, both personally and in your organization, and then check to see how effective you are in those areas and where needed to make a change. So I'll say goodbye for now. I wish you well as you read this chapter in this lesson and you become more aware of the stall mindset and how to overcome it.